Hello, everyone. This is the 2022 CP Snow Symposium, organized and hosted by Hal Conte with Justin Murphy's Other Life organization. This was a pleasure and a delight to be part of, and I'll let Hal take over from here.
Hello, everyone. I really appreciate you all for taking part in this Indie Thinkers Other Life Zoom conference on the concept of the two cultures. And I guess I just want to start by introducing my own essay, which is called The Two Cultures Today. So I had a number of inspirations for even hosting this forum. The first was I first read about this idea of the two cultures, and I was thinking, if there's really any place that can really discuss this concept like that I know of, it's Indie Thinkers, because there are a whole bunch of different websites or shows that discuss a lot of humanities topics. But here we really do have a genuinely mixed group of people who are interested in tech, science, and such things. I know there are people who really have this with things like nuclear energy on Indie Thinkers, and there are also people who are obsessed with Nietzsche. So I was thinking this would be a really good place. And then, so I just kind of threw it out there as an idea, but I began reading more and more of it, and it also began almost creeping into my own life in ever more interesting ways. So, in my first semester here at the University of Warwick, where I'm currently a student, I wrote a paper on we were doing this group paper project thing on something about Disney and media studies, but we came to a point where I wanted to cite Adorno, and a lot of my classmates were like, Adorno's not research, and I was kind of like, well, what do you even mean? Like, it just seems such a confusing concept. But when you're going through a lot of these social scientized research fields, even things like media studies, which you think would draw from a humanities approach, you do find that they really are trying to blend this kind of like scientific way of seeing the world in a belief, I guess, that makes things more serious or more objective. So, and that got me thinking just the way that we've constructed our universities, even though, like, obviously that doesn't make sense. It makes no sense to count all these different variables and then basically turn this very obvious kind of straightforward analysis into something that looks more impressive and, I guess, scientific minded just for the sake of it. And it got me thinking a lot about the way that universities have operated really since, because Snow was writing this in the 50s. Throughout the late 50s and onwards, you get the post-Cold War kind of huge growth of the university, a lot of investment in the sciences, but you really get the real story is the rise of social sciences and how those have developed. And just from what I've understood there, of course, is that famous, all those famous from like 1971, all these weird things began happening. Of course, they're relating it to the whole Nixon shock gold standard thing, but also like the decline of innovation. People like Peter Thiel will talk about a lot of the way we just look at research, and a lot of the way we're in universities today really is kind of based on this incremental model that sort of blends both the kind of experimental type of science that's not really looking at things in this large way, but also it's not taking into account this broader mind space the humanities can somebody in. So I figured writing this, that this is kind of what I'm seeing in my own life. And of course, all of these things, I'm only a grad student. Obviously, I don't really have extreme knowledge in the sciences. Obviously, a lot of these things that may look incremental to somebody like me would be really important and acknowledged as gigantic in the field. Snow said things like this about this and just the sciences. But I do just have a feeling that the way we've constructed our kind of the constitution of knowledge in universities really is based on this kind of failed mixing of the sciences and humanities, and maybe there's a better way of doing things. So with that, David King, do you want to introduce your paper?
Sure. Okay. Thanks. So I'll first introduce myself, which is that I used to be a scientist. I was a geneticist, and for the last 30 years or so, I've been working on issues to do with the politics of technology, and latter, sort of in the last 10, 15 years or so, I've been calling myself a Luddite. So, I was drawn to this topic really, and I've done something a bit different from what most of the other folks have done, in that I haven't really accepted the terms of the debate that were set by Snow and Leavis. I don't think the issue is exactly about science versus the humanities. It is in one sense, but really what the issue is technocracy as represented and techno-progressivism as represented by C.P. Snow versus the critique of technocracy. I think that's the real issue. And I mean, Joshua in his paper has done a great job of articulating a lot of that technique, and so I would have put a lot of that in my paper, but there wasn't space, so Joshua's done that job for me. Yeah, a couple of others you have mentioned, sort of C.P. Snow's, in my opinion, rather stupid views on, science and the Holocaust. Maybe we can talk about that later, and also about the Industrial Revolution. But the real question I was trying to answer with this is, it has been some kind of a role for the humanities to critique technocracy, techno-progressivism, industrial capitalism. Where's that critique gone nowadays? It's really hard to find it. And so what I've done is to do a kind of a sort of excavation of the history of technocracy over the 20th century up till the present, in order to kind of set the background for why it is that critique has gone away. And so I've talked about globalization, systems theory, and cybernetics, and neoliberalism. And the fundamental issue is that emerges out of all of that is it comes out of a quote from Frederick Taylor, the founder of scientific management, who said in his book, in the past the man was first, in the future the system will be first. And I think that's the core of the issue. And what we see in the mid-20th century is an evolution of technocratic control methods from a sort of approach which is really focused on control of the individual and forcing the individual to adapt to the system, to a much more system-focused approach, which is what cybernetics and system theory allows you to do, and it frees up the individual, supposedly at least, on that control. And that's what neoliberalism is, and that's why it's so incredibly successful, that the revolts of the 1960s against control of people and their bodies by the technocracy was recuperated by neoliberalism, and so people think they're getting freedom, basically. But okay, so the point then of all that is to say that the way the humanities have developed under that regime of system-focused control is basically what you get with post-structuralism and postmodernism. It's kind of sort of epistemological liberalism and extreme skepticism about the possibilities for actually knowing anything. And that serves as a kind of performative critique of technocracy, but it doesn't really critique technocracy. And so, yeah, so I give a couple of examples, from my own experience of the ways in which, the theory in the humanities performs a critique of what they call positivism, but actually serves to undermine a Luddite critique. So that's basically what I've done. And I think my conclusion is basically Snow won the debate. He had history on his side. The science is basically in control. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that contribution a lot. We can go on to discuss more later, but first, Josh, you can introduce your paper next.
Hey, many thanks. Appreciate it. And, great to see everybody. I really enjoyed reading your papers. So I'm Joshua Hansen. I'm an independent scholar, and, my current areas of interest are basically metamodernism, hypermodernity, as well as, doing an attempted demystification and in some ways destructuring of, what I see as the most prominent idols on the contemporary scene, which would be basically academia, science, and the internet. And so the title of my paper here is Inconciliance, Culture in an Age of Extreme Science. And I think the best way to introduce this is basically just to say something briefly about the main terms. And so, I'm drawing from a text by E.O. Wilson that's called Consilience. And what he's talking about there is basically a merger of science and the humanities. I would say that Wilson was probably the most prominent, visible sort of heir of C.P. Snow, although, from my perspective, he endorses a type of maybe a speculative positivism that I think lends itself towards basically a cultural imperialism of science. And people I perceive as being in league with this, would be all the usual suspects, including Steven Pinker. So, I think I can leave it at that. So that's the idea of consilience. As far as culture is concerned, I feel that Leibniz, although the argument was in there, he spent too much attention, kind of in the personal attacks and so forth. So the argument was there, but it maybe was too abstract. It wasn't fleshed out enough. It was too loose. And so I'm drawing from the French phenomenologist Michel Henry, and his view of culture is as a self-transformation of life towards higher forms of basically realization and completeness. And so now with the crisis of science, as bringing about a loss of meaning for life, he's taking this from Husserl. For Henri, we're at a point where life has turned against life, and this is what he refers to as barbarism. And, I would just note that basically, there's a way you could perceive this, maybe like in a critique of the Western sense. What I'm looking at is, the idea that there was a liberation involved, in opposing Roman imperialism, domination, what have you. That's not the way I'm invoking it. Well, I'm saying that this is an explicitly bad barbarism, in no way good. And so sort of the highest expression of this is something that I'm taking from the French cultural theorist Paul Virilio, what he calls extreme science. And this is science which threatens to bring about the end of all science, as well as all critical awareness. And, you kind of have to forgive me about the way that I invoke this guy. The way I feel about Virilio is basically probably similar to the way that Zizek invokes Lacan. I'm crazy about this guy. But so in any event, he's drawing attention to what he calls the integral accident. And, just by way of example, we could say 1986, within a period of 3 months or something like this, you have the explosion of the Challenger, along with Chernobyl. So these are anthropogenic sort of catastrophes, that are unprecedented and in a certain sense reveal the hidden face of scientific and technical progress. And so what I'm arguing for is, critical awareness and sort of preventive intelligence, active opposition to this barbarity. And, the claim is that only through inconciliance, opposing this sort of view is the only way that one can really engage with culture in an epoch of extreme science. And further, it doesn't matter, on my view, whether you're a collectivist, an individualist, a communist, a communitarian, even a techno-capitalist. Basically, if you want to live, we need to come up with a way, or, for your ancestors to live, we need to come up with a way to basically break the being of the current state of, what we're calling, institutional science and so on and so forth. And, I invite you to join me, in hopefully working towards that end. But so that's the end of my presentation. Many thanks. I enjoyed reading these papers and, I look forward to the discussion.
a rousing call to arms. OG Rose, you're.
Well, goodness, everyone, the presentations have been fantastic. I enjoyed reading everyone's work. Not only was it engaging, it was elegant. That is a wonderful, and I must say, if academia were to have symposiums like this, it might be of much more interest. So well done, Joshua. Wonderful presentation. Congratulations on your upcoming book. Mr. Barnes also is an elegant writer. I suggest Missing Axioms is in the work that he's coming. And to see papers that integrate Flannery O'Connor, like Arturo did, with other great minds is just a real treat. And Mr. King, I particularly think the point that you're bringing up on there seeming to be a difference between science, technology, literature, and this sort of state that is controlling everything by technology, I think is very prescient. I think it's very insightful. We do have to remember that when Mr. Snow is writing, there is not, say, the computer, there is not the robot, there is mostly technology, science, and industry are all put together. And I do think that distinctions have to be arisen to that are very, very important. The difference between the computer and, say, the hammer, both are forms of technology, but they're not the same kind of technology. So that's a form of a topic to consider. So I wrote on pathology, because that's always fun, and tried to go with something Hegelian, where I talked about the distinction between coherence and correspondence as epistemological tools, because I tried to come at Mr. Snow at kind of a different angle. Coherence, I'm going to associate with, say, the humanities, for example, where in the humanities, the arts, you learn how to think coherently, or kind of big systems, say, writing a novel, which you see, if you have anyone who's ever tried to write a novel, knows how remarkably difficult it is, because you have to hold it all together in your head, make sure you remembered what the characters did on page 5, so that it doesn't contradict with something on page 20, and you have to hold it all together. It's a remarkable intellectual act. And also, this is a very important act because it can help you figure out how to put things together that should go together, how to keep things apart that should be apart, to see patterns in things like that. And the humanities are very good of doing that. Unfortunately, unbound coherence can lead to, say, conspiracy thinking, or tribalism, where everyone is just finding people that believe like they do and never undergoing any falsification, and that can be a problem. The other side of it would be, say, correspondence, which is the notion that your idea corresponds with something in actuality. So, for example, green cat, there's no inherent contradiction in the idea of a green cat. A green cat is a possibility. I've just never seen one down by the barn. It doesn't correspond with anything in actuality. So the notion of science is generally supposed to be in the business of determining correspondence, or things that we have very good reason corresponds with actuality. Now, we can get into how certainty is ultimately impossible, and that's why you have the move toward falsification and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, it seems very, very good that you have these things dialectically relating to one another. Now, I think I completely agree, and I won't get into Mr. Barnes' paper where he was talking about having keeping a difference between the science and the arts, and what Mr. King was also saying. So I'm not supporting some sort of synthesis between those two things. In fact, what it would seem is that you need to learn how to do both so that they can dialectically relate to one another, and a dialectic only works if it doesn't, in fact, become a synthesis. Now, that would get us into where I think the idea of Hegel, where you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is not quite what Hegel was getting at, but then I would send us off on a tangent on that subject. So anyway, when you have correspondence without coherence, which tends to occur when you have the reign of science, if you will, well, you get a meaning crisis. Well, you get people that say, for example, if you think for yourself, but you're not one of the intellectual elites, or you're one of the elites, well, you're not in the laboratory to see what corresponds with reality, so you're not allowed to have those thoughts. So then when you have autonomous correspondence, then the question is, who are the people that can determine correspondence? And if it just happens to be a technocratic elite or people in power, well, then no one else is allowed to think for themselves, because coherence does not matter. So what ends up happening is both sides, if you don't have a relation between the two cultures. Now, of course, we have to get into the difference between relation and blending, because for me, those are not the same thing, but those would get into the technical distinctions between those. I think both of them end up very pathological. And I think the world today shows us the pathology that can sort of develop, where you have on one side, as I've noted, the technocratic elite that is controlling everyone with what they think will correspond. This is kind of the funny thing, too. When correspondence goes to the world of worldview, you actually don't know if it's going to correspond, but you have an idea of the future, and you're going to make the world that correspond with that future. So then it inevitably becomes it becomes power-driven and different things like that. So you have that pathology on this side, but then on the other side, you have a pathology of unleashed coherence, which is leading to conspiracies or everyone falling into ideology, as Zizek will talk about, and sticking to that and thinking and believing that the very coherent of the view is evidence that it is true. That we tend to think that if it is coherent, it therefore corresponds, but that is not necessarily the case. And so you can have a pathology develop over there, you can have a pathology develop over there, and then they fight and people don't get along very well. I will also say that not having that distinction between coherence and correspondent makes it very, very difficult to organize. It would be another subject, but there's a wonderful book called Kindly Inquisitors by Joshua Routs that I mentioned in the paper. Without that distinction between coherence and correspondence, it becomes very, very difficult to determine free speech, what should be taught in schools, what should be something that is part of an official criteria, what should be space for people to debate about. All of that becomes very chaotic, and I'd be happy to expand on this topic in the conversation, but I'll bring what I'm saying to a close. It is not by chance when you have this pathological relationship between the two cultures, you also have a loss of free speech. Because it becomes very, very difficult to figure out how to exercise the dialectical balance between coherence and correspondence. So I think all of those things go together, which is all the more reason that it's wonderful we're having this symposium where people can speak freely about these topics so that we can move to a better world, hopefully. So Hal, thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, I strongly sympathize with everything you just said. Next up, we have Samuel Barnes.
So I haven't really got much to add other than my actual words. My response is pretty tight, pretty short. So if it's okay with everyone, I'd just like to read it verbatim. Is that okay? So my response to Two Cultures is called Making Music in the Chemistry Department. In the Two Cultures, Snow asserts there are two apparent segregated groupings among intellectuals, one literary, the other of the sciences. These cultures described by Snow back in 1959 are observed among the undisputed upper echelons of the hierarchy of the intellectual world, the university. Snow and his contemporaries had a particular concern for the continued dominance of such institutions. The separation of these cultures, seen as a threat to this, the holistic knowledge of classical education is subtly fetishized, whereas the disparate spheres of interest observed by Snow are viewed as the ruins of failed intellectual life. So that's my opening, basically. And the point I want to get at here is that Snow's view is incredibly outdated. It's based on like 1959. And the problem is we currently have a hangover of that today. We're still obsessed with the university, still obsessed with bringing the university back to something that we imagine it was. But as I sort of describe in my response, it's no more than an arm of the techno-capital government at this point. And I haven't really got much else to add other than, you know, when it comes down to it, the culture arm of what Snow's looking at is basically the aughts of aesthetics, of art, of writing, and the sciences are essentially the is. And I you know, it's those objective empirical sciences, and I'm sort of deriving that from David Hume's is-ought distinction. And I'm sort of, you know, fundamentally questioning whether they should be the same thing. We seem to have this, as intellectually minded people, we seem to have this weird idea that they need to be the same thing or connected in some way. But I think they're completely different distinctions. So that's pretty much all I have to add on top of what you guys have said.
Thank you very much. And finally, we have Arturo, if I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yes. Well, thank you. So I have less of the scientific background, I think, than that you guys have, though I'm not a scientific illiterate, or at least scientifically literate enough to know when I am one. And I read Snow's manifesto, and I thought that he writes with a lot of energy and passion that I wouldn't have expected from a scientist who doesn't understand art. And I think that Snow is not I mean, we have to put it in its context. So I suppose he was defensive because after the Second World War and the Holocaust, many people were saying this is, what science does. Science makes the atom bomb. Scientific management led to the concentration camps. And then Snow comes forward saying, wait a minute, what about you guys? What about you guys with your Nietzschean romantic tendencies? We have to put it in its historical context, that why he was defending science in this way. But I think that Snow is not, he's not trashing the arts and humanities. Rather, he's asking more of them. He's asking them, why don't you create some, ode or some paean, how do you pronounce that? I don't know. Why don't you express or just see this miracle, how millions of people are being lifted out of poverty and misery by science? Isn't this glorious? Why do you want to live in your desk drawer, ignore all that? And so it's a plea that's perhaps potentially attractive to many artists, but I think that Snow, he left out a lot, and he ignored a lot of people and a lot of things and forces in the world. First of all, he fixates on Eliot and Yeats, who were particularly reactionary Pound, and he ignored someone who was by then, I guess, very established and recognized, Aldous Huxley, who certainly was scientifically literate. Certainly, he was very cautious about what's the dangers of the managerial society. But I think Huxley very explicitly distinguishes between this Taylorite managerial idea, which is today packaged and sold to us as science, and actual science. And today, we don't have the third culture, that marriage that Snow as well as Huxley were advocating, because we have all these fields of partly of a certain mystification that alienate people significantly from science and from literature. We live in this world where technocratic management and expertocracy are institutions that and establishments that present themselves as the science. So all these people on Twitter who read The Guardian, they say that you are a scientific ignoramus if you don't agree with my position. I have this or that stat. And writers also, literary people, poets are completely beholden to this. They are beholden to the statistic. They have no, recollection of things like Mark Twain. It was very subversive when he says, there are lies, damned lies, statistics, so I think it's important to distinguish between expertocracy and science. Scientists are a bit more anarchists in many ways, regardless of whether they're right wing or left wing in their ideology. They're a bit less hierarchical than the social scientists or than the technical managers. And scientists, like I spoke to, for I'm not a scientist like most of you guys, so I have a lot of anecdotal experience and conversations. But like I remember speaking to an astronomer, a lady who told me that she, by studying astronomy, she's an astronomer, like in university, she realized the limitations of science, and that made her become a painter. So scientists are more aware of the limitations. Scientists as in physicists, as in chemists or physicists, biologists are much more prescient as to the limitations of science, and they're humbler before the unknown, and they're aware that science has is not necessarily always anti-romanticism, because there's something romantic about the quest of delving into the unknown, seeking an answer. But the threshold of that which is unknown perhaps always remains. Maybe the Enlightenment believed that we could have an answer to absolutely everything. During the Enlightenment, people believed that. But today we have, I think, the regime of the social sciences, and also we have and technocracy, and I guess lastly, what I say in my piece is that Snow wrote his manifesto before what postmodernism calls the death of the author, when a writer like Aldous Huxley, a writer like Eliot or Flannery O'Connor, to name a woman, could easily be seen as a kind of conjurer, as someone who has a message for the young people, for the youth, who wants some answers, who wants some some vision from somebody who's on the fringes, on the limits of society. And academia has successfully destroyed that from every angle. And so now no one turns to the shaman, no one turns to an Eliot, no one turns to a more radical poet than Eliot politically, or any outsider writer or intellectual, but they turn to academics, to theorists. And these are people who might be in each other's antipodes, right? Like in my paper, I mentioned Judith Butler and Jordan Peterson. And I'm aware that they are like arch enemies and so on. But Peterson he's an academic. He's from Harvard, and he's seen as he's a former Harvard professor, and he's seen as a spiritual advisor to young people who follow him. Judith Butler, Slavoj Žižek, all these theorists, they're all from the academy, and what unites them is that they all have a terrible writing style, even if they are very different writing styles. To the merit of Peterson, he's at least able to recommend better writers than him to his followers. So he tells them to read Hemingway or Dostoevsky. But I see them as a result of this successful project of postmodernism, the death of the author, which was not a reality in Snow's time. So I think that writers and artists and scientists today have to see their common enemies, social scientists, or social science is not necessarily the enemy, but this fetishization of what's called of the social studies and the technocracy, which is not necessarily scientific, but it controls people by exploiting ordinary people's insecurities about their ignorance about science. Because it's very easy to make somebody feel stupid because of their scientific illiteracy, which is a result of education. And then it's easier to control people by saying this is the science, in the same way that clerical authorities claimed to know natural law during the Middle Ages. So I guess I'll stop.
Thank you all very much for your contribution. Just each other a round of applause, because everyone presented very well. I believe we've got through everyone, unless my brain's not working. Dave, your essay was really interesting. It reminded me a lot of Adam Curtis, actually. This analysis of the way that neoliberalism is related to the rise of all this thinking. And a lot of your essays and yours reminded me a lot of this concept of Simone Weil when she described the idea of the apparatus. And I was just wondering, because of course you're really looking less at technology and more at technocracy, to what extent do you think that technocracy is something that necessarily requires technology, or is it a mode of thinking that's kind of this very linear or this kind of programmatic way of thinking or totalizing way of thinking? Or do you think that this means that, for an example, one could use technology, like Luddite lens, not really seeing the world through the street? Or is the problem that technology, the devices we've created, creates this form of thinking, or at least incentivizes it?
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's a great question, and it relates to something I was going to say later, which is that this word technocracy has been, has come up in different ways in different people's talks here, and there are slightly different meanings to it. And I'm using a meaning to it, which is, actually probably not that common in that technocracy tends to get used in the way that Arturo used it, managerialism, basically, expertocracy. And I'm using it in a bit of a broader and I think deeper sense than that, in terms of, I think that the beginning of technocracy was in the scientific revolution of the 17th century. I'm drawing here upon Caroline Merchant in particular and her book, The Death of Nature. And she describes, and the motto of technocracy is, Francis Bacon's maxim that knowledge is power. He said that 350 years before Michel Foucault. So I think technocracy in that sense, in that very broad sense of, yes, a general regime of control over people and nature partly through technology, through scientific discourses, obviously, but also through other types of, I think this is what your question goes to, is also other types of expert knowledge, which can actually be in the humanities and the social sciences as well. And this was one thing that I had to slightly cut out of my paper for lack of space, is that I think what's going on in the two cultures critique is not, it is partly this, critique of technocracy in general, but it's a critique that is being, it's an argument between two wings of technocracy. There's the science-based technocracy and there's the humanities-based technocracy. And Snow is actually quite right in saying that the form of technocracy that operated is certainly in England up till the 1960s is about, you train the young people in good literature and in the classics, in speaking the Roman, Latin and Greek, and this produces good citizens who become the people who are best qualified to manage and run society. And so the civil service exams, for example, you used to have to, do Latin and Greek in those. There's this other side of technocracy, and we've got a war going on between them. With Snow and Leavis, you're just on the cusp of where there's some kind of common ground between them, which is humanism. Both of them are basically still coming at the world from a fundamentally humanist point of view. The system has not yet become first. The human being is still, has a place, and there's a place for the critique of the system-based management coming out of concepts such as human dignity. I think I don't know whether I've fully answered your question there, but there's different senses in which technocracy is used.
So it definitely sounds like you're not just saying this is the fault. Arturo, you did want to say something, I think, because you're clearly trying to make a point.
Well, just in response to this sentence, Francis Bacon, I don't see why we should attribute originality to that, because for the medieval church, knowledge is power was a pretty clear formula. They were, guardians of knowledge and literacy, and to them, I don't believe that Francis Bacon said something particularly, we shouldn't project that much originality onto Bacon saying knowledge is power, and there's I think technocracy is a continuation of a certain kind of clericalism, and many scientists like Snow and Asimov, that who also wrote science fiction, condemn clericalism, but knowledge is power. Is that really and new and I think we have to remember that humanism was rather new and yeah.
One could even take that back to when with Akhenaten, the ancient Egyptians and all of the other ancient religions also basically were, a lot of them relied on the fact of the priests having this contact with the powerful gods as opposed to the ordinary citizens who didn't have that. And this I know a lot of people who have compared the clerical relationship played by the church with the way that the media and the various sciences and the quote unquote expert class operate. And that reminded me a lot of OG Rose. I'm sorry, now I guess we're going out of order. First, did you want to respond, David, to Arturo?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, so what you said there, Arturo, actually reminded me a lot of Illich, actually, in that he talks about the church and the corruption of the church in that way. I think, though, that I don't think it's just someone like Carolyn Merchant. A lot of people would argue, and Foucault is one of them, that what you get with the scientific revolution is the inception of what we call now modernity, and that's that particular way of uncovering facts about the natural world, embodying those facts in machinery, literal machines, in order to structure the world in your own, in the interests of those that have that particular knowledge and own those machines, and of course the structuring of the world through scientific and technological discourses and disciplines, as Foucault would say. That is actually, I think that is actually new, and it's a shift in history. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, I just, do we want to go to order? I guess that's the question. If I wanted to go to OG first, or if I wanted to, going down the original list, go to Josh first. I did have a question for Josh. Is related is that and this is also related to things that you were saying, Arturo, the way the sciences kind of operate as kind of this epistemological imperialism, the idea that appealing to the science is the ultimate win, oh well, the science says this, therefore your argument's irrelevant type thing. And you see people like Steven Pinker write books full of this is why science proves that the current world's better than any time that's ever existed before. So I have that question for you, Josh, as well as about this cultural supremacy of science, as well as OG. Do you think that how do you think people should approach those sorts of appeals to scientific authority? Because on one hand, somebody might say, well, the science got the pandemic wrong. But then, of course, they can reply by saying two things. One, the true science has never been tried. You can always pull that argument. And then two, just would critique on their terms be the right way to do this? Or does it need to be, you need to look at this through this lens of saying maybe there are other values or other ways of knowing that are also relevant or maybe higher in some other way?
All right, that's a great question. There's a ton of stuff there, and it kind of touches on things that many other people referenced in their paper as well. The first thing that comes to mind would be like the fact-value distinction. And, I think that there's an aspect of the fact-value distinction that I would defend. But basically, and this also invokes the idea of like an orthogonality, between technical science and then, let's say the life world, species being, and so on and so forth. And, I wouldn't defend an extreme orthogonality, but as it extends to the institutional character of science, the university, and so on and so forth, I see them as sort of collectively dedicated to advancing the technical system and the technological understanding of being, which is, that's what the crisis of science and its loss of meaning for life is. And since that's the case, I'm not a constructivist, but I could look at the work of somebody like Bruno Latour and, draw from that to say there absolutely is an aspect where there's a social construction of science. And I think that, Leavis is somebody who gestured toward this, where he's talking about that science ultimately, it may have been one of his other essays on this. He had like at least 2 responding to Snow, but he's talking about, science is generally, even though it's, it's quantitative, it is conducted through language. And this is something that is going to kind of, that is going to have an aspect, plus the entire backdrop. Today, you could look at the entire funding structure of science, the biotechnology sort of complex, and so on and so forth. So basically, I don't know that I could directly answer your question, other than to say I would defend extreme orthogonality against the current institutional apparatus. Basically, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of like the questions about where do we derive authority, and that the comment by Levi is interesting because the way we invoke science is a literary act or an act of language. When we're mentioning science, we're not like performing an experiment in front of somebody. We're calling up language in a certain sense to learn to like exhibit a form of meaning or an argument of some type ultimately. And I did mention how like a lot, it's funny, of course, it's almost unfair terrain to argue. I'm not saying this like I'm just saying like if this was all argued out over essays, of course there are way more contributions by people who are defending the humanities than defending the sciences. OG, did you want to add something to this? And by the way, the correspondence versus coherence thing reminded me also of another concept in Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, where the ultimate like goal of a totalitarian, or the ultimate impressive thing of a totalitarian movement, is that it sees things or it argues based on this strictly logical way. So it tries to put those into place. And I guess my question in terms of the way of coherence and correspondence, is this kind of is this problem or is this issue a matter that's inherent in thinking in these ways, or does this only really come into place via practice? Because if it goes into the question of thought, that does raise the obvious realization that thinking and speaking has consequences, which I know I'm definitely a free speech devotee, a free speech person, but I know that the whole claim that speech could be dangerous or thought could be dangerous or harmful is an argument traditionally made by opponents of freedom of speech.
Oh man, Hal, the question on the coherence correspondence, that gives me like a 3-book trilogy called The True Isn't the Rational to explore all that fun stuff. A few things. First off, everyone, OG means Opperman Garner. I'm not a gangster. I came up with that. My wife and I write together in 2011, in case anyone is knowing. I'm not any good at hip hop, but please go see Bernard Hankins, our dear friend, who I think is the best spoken word poet around. Second, everything that's been said, there were a few things that came to mind. Arturo, Dave. So first off, Mr. King, I think what comes to mind when you were saying this kind of deeper transformation
information between people's relation to technology. It brings to mind kind of the split between the world being turned into standing reserve, according to Heidegger on one side, and then over here I always associate the Hermann Hesse glass bead game with people using culture to like get status and who can make the reference here, and oh, I'm super smart because I know who Art Crane is. And so you have these two sides where you've gone from a very way of approaching technology, of seeing the world as all being potential use for technology. It's not merely managerial, although I think Arturo is correct that there's a history of that going with managerial and control. And I think it does, because when the world becomes standing reserve and culture becomes glass bead games, well, then you can't stop the clergy class because you're all participating in the system. And so then you get controlled. That kind of breaks down the ability to have any sort of front against it. And so I always split it between the world being split between Heidegger and Hermann Hesse. Now, I know at the beginning of Hermann Hesse, at the beginning of that, he says no one does the glass bead game and doesn't evolve anymore, but it's always been a great mental model for me of how people shore fragments against ruin, like at the end of the wasteland. It's also quite interesting to the point Arturo is making on the notion that, so it does seem to be the case that knowledge has always been power, but it seems as if you had revelation as power, then you had the Protestant Reformation, you start going revelation and reason as power, and now you have a sort of one where it's more like reason is power. And there are some people that will associate the Protestant Reformation with the beginning of modernity. Now, I know that's a popular thesis. I'm not an expert on that and so on and so forth. But it is quite interesting that it's almost when you had, say, the church could tell you God's will alone, and you had to go to them. That's almost like the class today of scientists that tell you the truth and you have to listen to it. So then people are like, well, we got to break that up if we go with a Martin Luther or Zimmerman and different people. So you give people the Bible, and then everyone has access to the source material. But here's the thing, they have to interpret the source material. So then they have to get really good at reasoning so that they can understand the source material. Well, wait a minute, once they get good at reasoning, they start going, well, why should I just reason about the Bible? And then they start reasoning about other things. So you can have this movement where then it can go in the direction where you have today of a autonomous rationality or an autonomous reasoning that has these pathological consequences that I think can become very problematic. So those are thoughts. Another thought I had that was really interesting that I'd never thought before is, you know how we kind of talk about, we know there's a difference between someone who makes movies and someone who watches movies. There's kind of like a cultural difference. We kind of know that. We all know that there's a difference between someone who does science and someone who consumes facts, but we really don't actually have much of a language for that. In the same way that we have an idea of going to the movies, we don't talk about going to the scientist, right? It's almost like we treat science as the act of learning facts as the same as doing science. When actually, I think an important point is usually like, and this was noted, that people who do science actually can be quite different from people who say read The Guardian for facts that they can claim science so they can get their political view. In the same way that somebody that likes to watch movies is quite different than someone who says makes movies. And it's just interesting. It's a thought I'd have to go write a paper on and lock myself in a closet on the difference between the lack of sort of the cultural language for that distinction is important. Because I was reading a computer site, and someone may know this and I don't, I think it's called a no knowledge proof, in where it's like a proof that you see and it's like proved to you even if you don't know the knowledge behind it. It's a no knowledge proof, I think is the term. We in culture act like facts are no knowledge proofs. That's what we act like. We act like they're no knowledge proofs when they're not, because you don't know this. You don't know the process that gave rise to the fact to know if it was corrupted or not. And that's part of the problem. Is facts are not no knowledge proofs. We like to tell ourselves they're no knowledge proofs because then we can win our debate and shut that guy up down the street whenever we go to the bar and he makes us talk about politics. We're gonna beat that guy up. But they're not no knowledge proofs. And that's where you need, in the same way that the Bible, that was the kind of the whole Protestant Reformation, the Bible is not a no knowledge proof. You have to interpret it. Well, that means you have to bring in reasoning. Well, that means you could have the risk of splitting apart fragmentation because people could reason differently, and that's a problem. And then to tie to your question, Hal, the issue that I think when we talk about the banality of evil in Hannah Arendt, what's very, very important is that does not mean evil is boring. People think like there's a boredom to evil. Everyone knows that Eichmann was like a vacuum salesman and so on and so forth. Really, it's more like the everydayness of evil, where evil becomes something thoughtless, something you do without even thinking about doing it. And in order to get to that, what ends up happening is basically coherence and correspondence combined, where you just assume if you're doing it in your everyday that it corresponds with the moral life. So for example, if this minority group over here is, say, part of the problem, that's why Germany is not doing thriving like it needs to do, you come to the place where you're surrounded by people where your very everyday life reinforces that, and you never go beyond your everyday life to see that that moral premise does not correspond with actuality, and then your everydayness continues to reinforce the coherence of that view, and so they combine together. So then you participate in evil without even thinking that you're participating in evil, because you stop asking questions of correspondence. And in a way, what happens is coherence and correspondence combine. And then to close the point, there's been this interesting sort of notion that we've been discussing where science and like humanities need one another, but then they shouldn't be the same thing. And then it's like they shouldn't try to be one another, but they also need one. This kind of weird thing. I think it is a dialectical tension. And of course, someone who likes Hegel uses dialectic in every third sentence, so forgive me. But there is this interesting need to move dialectically between coherence and correspondence. If coherence and correspondence ever combine, and the phrase I use to refer to that is the true is the rational. If the true ever equals the rational, as opposed to maintain distinct categories where they very often overlap, but they're not the same thing, then you tend to fall into the banality of evil. So there's a few things. You tend to fall into the banality of evil. You tend to fall into conspiratorial thinking. You tend to fall into scientocracy or maybe sensocracy. We could actually bring in China as a good example of movement from like industrial revolution, get everyone out of poverty, and then into the sensocracy, Alexander Bard, everyone's controlled by the government. China would actually be a fascinating case study of this overfitting of technology, but also, so there's a lot of things that emerge when correspondence equals coherence and the true is the rational.
Once you create, once you put into place a society that's based on these technocratic assumptions, then people can just go through these things and it'll be part of their everyday lives. Yes. Of course, you don't think about something that's part of your ordinary life as something that isn't ideological or manufactured. It's something that's very real to you. If you're in Nazi Germany, the Jews are inferior because they're treated in all these inferior ways by the Nazis, not because Jews are inherently inferior, but because they've been positioned in this way in society. Your contribution reminded me a lot of another kind of thing, which I don't think we've seen recently, but I do think people use the online references to just facts in a similar way. In the 1990s, there was this really, and throughout the 50s as well. So when C.P. Snow was writing, there was this real big concern among intellectuals about the popularity of quiz shows and the idea of like knowing a whole bunch of different facts, and then that being like a form of knowledge. And people are very skeptical of this. Neil Postman, who's he came up with the concept of technopoly, which is this idea that technology is kind of our societal paradigm and it is kind of the religion of society and nobody can possibly question it today. He was also very critical of this kind of quiz show like knowledge of individuals' particular facts as a way of understanding the world. So Samuel, I don't believe you've spoken for a while. You can go next.
Am I supposed to speak now? Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff being raised. I again, on that thread of thought, would also critique the idea of substantive reality as just a collection of esoteric facts, I think that's probably where I would agree with Snow as opposed to disagreeing with him. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, let's go back to Daniel Garner, OG Rose. Okay. So what do you think about all of substantive reality being a collection of esoteric facts? Do you think that's metaphysically possible?
Well, I mean, Wittgenstein, the world is everything that is the case, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the issue is that does the world include your relation to everything that is the case? Does the world include, if the video camera is looking at the TV screen that's showing the image of it and creates that eternal regression, Are you actually seeing the video camera, or are you always stuck just seeing a simulation or something pointing to the video camera that is not equal to it? I think that could get into like vector theory with Mr. Alung or Mr. Bard, where you would say that I don't necessarily like, to what degree would we say you could even get into qualia and different things. The experience of, say, loving my wife, is that a fact in the world? Or is that an emergent property of the facts in the world relating into a certain way? I would want to avoid reductionism, even though I would want to maintain distinction. For me, I like a metaphysical, I just finished an extremely long paper, if you want to read it, called The Void, on maintaining a metaphysical theory that incorporates vector theory, Alexander Ebel theory of total relations, where you can have distinction but maintain irreducibility. I do think that's quite possible. But funny enough, you only really, like, this is the thing. Like, let's say, for example, you accept a metaphysical principle where the world is everything that is the case, it is a collection of facts. You will never experience anything in facticity that would suggest that is not true, because you can always maintain a internally consistent system of which that is the truth, and therefore always incorporate the information in a manner to confirm that. So that's the funny thing. That's what I call the absolute choice, which is based on your interpretation of absolute knowing in Hegel. If the very fact that you're stuck always supporting the internal consistency of your interpretation in the world if that is evidence that that actually is the case, or is it just evidence that you're incapable of not thinking that way? So you get to choose. You have to make a radical choice, and I think that's what I would say to that. You have to choose your relation to that thing. But the very fact you have to choose it, and that choice in of itself determines the relation to the facts that cannot be reduced to the facts, which would suggest that there are emergent properties to facticity that cannot be reduced to facticity, even if facticity is necessary for that emergence. You know, this is why I think you have to uncouple a lot of categories where you can say something is necessary for X, but X is not reducible to what is necessary. So I think you have to make those distinctions.
Yeah, and I think this kind of proves the point that I was trying to get at in what I wrote, is that we can spend years and years debating whether these things are connectable, but they're not, in my opinion. You know, the ought and the is completely separate.
Well, I actually wanted to comment on that, because there's kind of this danger of a, say, Freudian return to the womb, where you make everything equal everything else, but ironically, that's the death drive. Like, the funny thing in Freud is that the desire to, like, unify, like an ultimate unity where everything is the same thing, actually is the death drive, because that's not possible. There's a difference. I like to say there's a difference between wholeness, where everything is whole in the same thing, and harmony, where there is difference, but everything relates in a manner to where they create something emergent. Like, for example, a symphony orchestra, if they were all the same instrument, Beethoven's Ninth wouldn't sound very good if you only had violins. You know, the possibility of Beethoven's Ninth is precisely because of the difference relating in a manner that creates a harmony. So I actually think maintaining difference is very, very important. And of course, the word wholeness can be used as a simile for harmony, but I do think actually you end up in a pathology of science and humanities when they try to do the other thing rather than respect difference and sort of see how they can play together and get along while maintaining that difference. So I think relation while maintaining irreducibility is important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to bring this up as an open question. I know that Joshua's got a whole project on this one, but I'm kind of wondering, I mean, part of my writing was a critique of Snow as, you know, it's defending something that's kind of outmoded, outdated in a way. Like, things have moved on in the last 50 years, for example. And I was just wondering, like, in this group here, like, is there anyone who really has any faith in the academic institution as it stands? Because I definitely consider myself anti-academic as it goes. I mean, Josh, I know you've got some strong opinions on this. I mean, I just want to open that up to the floor in terms of, like, what are we trying to save here, if anything, or are we just trying to destroy?
You can go first, Josh. I guess I'll first just to kind of defend. If I wanted to, like, steelman C.P. Snow's argument, I'd say we're basically all complaining over our society is the most, like, wealthy, prosperous society that has ever been invented. All this stuff. I mean, what are we reduced to arguing about on Twitter? The most, like, ridiculous nonsense imaginable. In the meantime, we go about our everyday lives and we're taking for granted we can call each other thousands of miles apart via a computer because of something developed in a university by all of these mental models that were just dissing, like, undereducated naifs. So I'll just that's what CP.
I'm
yes,
glad you.
Sorry.
Could I respond to that? What is it? I'm glad that you set that up, because if Samuel was asking me, like, do I have any faith in academia? I don't really have, much that I can say other than, of course, absolutely not. So I take, Hal's point, and, this is the main sort of thing that I'm trying to argue against, which is, speaking of, like, let's say the idyllic campus scene, where people are nibbling on charcuterie boards and, sipping lattes while, discussing how they're going to save the world. At the same time, this entire thing is based on a pyramid scheme of human immiseration, where, if you delve into this, even remotely, this is what is concealed, is the fact that, almost all of our products are, produced, in sweatshops that benefit corporations, which university endowments are invested in. And there's all sorts of endowed, shares that are being paid for in monopoly money, that constitutes the stolen wages of sweatshop labor. And, those are just the, the arrangements of this economic domination, where, the campus, many of these campuses are in, the most militarized sort of nations in the world. So they're secured by force externally and internally. And, those are just sort of the economic security state arrangements, not to mention the fact that through the process, this is where the critique of extreme science comes in. We're talking about tremendous alienation. There's with hypermodernity, we have this deworlding, that we actually are a part of here, a denaturing, a death of the social. This is the sort of circumstance where, if I agree with somebody, I can't even embrace them. And if I disagree, I can't even reach out to slap their face, in a sense. So, basically you have these issues along with, basically increasing anthropogenic catastrophe directly connected to, the advancement of the technical sciences. And so I'll just close on this point because I think it's a somewhat powerful point. I'm open to the criticism, like, yes, I'm talking, right? All I'm engaged in is talk. And this is quite different than the hard-nosed world of practical business or something of this sense. In this situation, I would invoke Rousseau, who basically, he played a substantial part in shaping the modern world, no doubt, in some ways good, in some ways bad, but nevertheless, at the very outset of his project is the first discourse where he's talking about the moral degradation that has accompanied the advancement of the sciences and the arts. I've only spoken about the sciences. I haven't really talked about the arts. And if I had more room, I would have done that, because Virilio's critique of the arts as being influenced by technical science, or basically it's becoming a very terminal art, where on the one hand you have like the freeze frame capture of the look of death, basically death live, on one hand, is something we increasingly see, along with like the movement towards a transgenic art, where it's going to be almost a type of genetic expressionism that is seeking to break the being, of the human species. And, so what I'm saying is that the university and the present state of technical sciences happen to pose an existential, threat, like a real existential threat. I'm not just, saying the word, I'm saying an actual existential threat to, the species, to the planet, where you have these various, you have these scientists speaking like, oh yes, we'll be safe once we get to our exoplanet. And this is where, Virilio's he's almost doing a reinterpretation of the book of Genesis in a certain sort of, this is like an eschatological revelation of where we're going to be exiled from the planet, and so on and so forth. But anyway, so that's how I would answer that, and, so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, Arturo, you definitely look very primed to respond to that.
Yeah. I was going to respond to Samuel's comment, but what Joshua says, I appreciate that we should also talk about art and the demoralization and destruction of art, mainly because that's what I'm chiefly dedicated to, art, not the destruction of it necessarily. But I have tried not to pay attention to NFTs. I've not paid any attention to NFTs yet. But of course, that would come up at some point. And regarding what Joshua, what he says about many of these universities being at the center of the military-industrial complex, I agree with that and the hypocrisy, but I also agree with how Noam Chomsky, when he would be criticized for conducting all his research and at MIT, which has its laboratories at the very center of the military-industrial complex, he would say that it's true, but it gives him access to these tools. And then he would talk about he would give the example of Marx studying at the British Library, which was at the late 19th century, the place, the warehouse for everything that was plundered from the colonies. And he'd ask, was Marx, who of course was unlike Chomsky, not an academic, was Marx right to use the British Library? Absolutely, because it gave him what he needed. But responding to Samuel, I also say I have no faith in academic institutions at all. But I also find that many of the current ecosystem of the magazines devoted to defending free speech against this academic, movement that wants to destroy civil liberties, most of them are ironically very much devoted to the university, like Aereo magazine and Quillette and these other platforms are all very much devoted to trying to save the university, trying to save the academy. And I think that we should maybe, without being, anti-intellectual, we should wish some, good riddance to the prestige of the academy. But at the same time, it would be necessary to create some alternative structure, alternative, popular education, and so that people can develop and have these discussions outside of university, like book clubs or science clubs. I think Carl Sagan wanted something like that, popular scientific education and science clubs. And I'm also wondering whether OG, what he thinks are the social causes of people arriving at these conspiracy theories. I somewhat, grasp the concepts you're using from Hume, which are very interesting. But also, do people resort to conspiracy theories because they're denied development? They're denied the right to use their intellectual faculties, so then they use them anyway, but they come up with these conspiracy theories. I also think we should look at, when criticizing science, we should also look at the economic power over science, who funds it. Like, why were so many scientists so eager to side with Fauci time and again? Because Fauci, not because Fauci is some kind of genius, he's not, but because Fauci controls the funding for most scientists, controls their, anyway, I shoved a bunch of things together in one comment. But.
Yeah, you made a lot of really interesting points about the way that people interact with these things. Of course, it is mostly through the university. And I guess the question is, who's carrying out that popular education? I know in the area of like political popular education or people who use this language, I forget his name, Vijay Prashad, the guy who runs Tricontinental, does a lot of that sort of thing. But of course, people always eventually appeal to some kind of authority. So the question is as well, like, I mean, ultimately becomes who are you able to trust on this? David, you have your hand raised.
Okay. Yeah, well, I was going to say about 6 things, but actually Arturo said quite a few of them. So, I mean, I'll just say a little bit about my personal experience as not as an academic, but as a campaigner on the politics of technology. I end up having to work with a lot of academics, because these are kind of unpopular issues, they're kind of intellectual issues often, and I end up working with a lot of academics, and I do get terribly frustrated with the way in which they are, incredibly cautious because of the neoliberalization of the university, they know that their jobs are on the line if they step out of line, and so and that can happen to really, really senior people as well, so yeah, that's just a little bit of personal experience. But I wanted to just come back to what I was saying a bit about this particular irony that I dealt with at the end of my in the second half of my paper, that the university used to be a place for a humanist critique of technocracy and of the kind of things that Joshua has spoken about. And now we're in a space where the underlying philosophy in the humanities has become so sort of under the hegemony of science, in terms of in my paper I talk about particularly about systems theory and how that leads to epistemological sort of ultra skepticism that you get in postmodernism, and now in this buzzword of the last 10 years, anti-essentialism, which is the same thing. Basically, they create this straw person of, an essentialism supposedly that existed in the bad old past, in which this is the dragon that they've slayed. It's the same thing. So we're in this bizarre situation now where you have the humanities, rather than making the critique of technocracy, actually undermining the critique of technocracy. It's kind of that's a rather scary situation, and we haven't yet talked about it, and it's probably will throw a hand grenade into the discussion. But you have to say that the gender ideology that comes out of the universities is an example of this, and the way in which we now are in this position of such extreme idealism in the humanities, that my subjective experience of what my gender is more real actually than biological maleness or femaleness, because that's a social construct, right? So we're in the position where the humanities are really playing, serving the function in many ways as cheerleader for the technocracy, and undermining any resistance, and that is scary, and that is a particular function of the academic setup, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We are coming up kind of soon on the 4:30 mark. Daniel, I assume that a lot of you probably want to say things for 30 more minutes. It sounds like a lot of you are really interested in continuing to discuss things. Did anyone want to respond to him or start with something else? I guess one thing that I wanted to say that I just think is kind of, we've been discussing technocracy as this as a running thread here, and I guess my question is, what would a non-technocratic way of understanding things, or epistemology or way of running the world look like today? I mean, it's very hard in a certain way. the way that I've always understood a lot of these things is the difference between automation and literal artificial intelligence AI. I think our entire society right now is basically, to a certain extent, on a form of automation. A lot of things are done without actual conscious decision making by people in society who are ultimately just not really required, even though we have choices, we're not really required to, or indeed make any decisions about how things are done. If there could be some kind of way of steering this seemingly autopiloted battleship, maybe that would be, but of course, what would that look like? It's a very good question. Joshua, it looks, and Sam, yeah, you can go first.
Yeah, to something like that, that's where what I'm basically arguing for is, in the realm of social action, where it would be something like a new great refusal, that would encompass like a collaborative renewal of consciousness and, trying to cultivate reflective awareness, preventative intelligence, acknowledgement of the integral accident, what Virilio calls a gray ecology, dealing with some of the, fallout of, technical progress and so on and so forth. And, I just want to make the acknowledgement, that Arturo, he makes a great point pertaining to Marx as well as Chomsky. And, I'm fully aware that, we are technologically inframed right now. That's absolutely the case. So I do have my own performative contradictions in some sense. Many of these technologies, they're corporate connected, the phones, they have all the associated moral hazard with it. However, to critics, not necessarily anybody here, but I'm just saying in the general sphere, critics on that particular account, I'm somebody that I'm not going to praise the criminal mindset for the prison food. And, so that's why, I think that basically this sort of within the social realm, I'm trying to think of all the people who talk about this, it could be Frankfurt to Hannah Arendt. Many different thinkers have discussed this, and that's the issue with technological enframing. It'd be very difficult to go back, right? It would be tremendously difficult to go back, which is why it's basically highly, not very actionable. But so I see technology as a rip current. It's almost impossible to swim against it without drowning. And so perhaps the only safe pathway is to swim parallel to the shore. And, basically that's what I have on that.
Sam, I believe you had your hand raised before,
so,
and then Dave.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to Dave's general point, is that people get confused about this technocracy we're in, right? And they connect it to some sort of oligarchy, which we're obviously in as well. But this thing sort of forms a false epistemological inframing, right? This only ends when we stop 99% of internet searches going through Google, right? This only ends when we stop saying studies have shown, right? We point to an oracle like studies, whatever that means, right? 90%, like all of the articles that are like, oh, a study has shown so and so, like they're written based on someone reading an abstract. They're not even like, there's no connection between that and epistemology anymore. And essentially, there's not even like a substantive group of people who you would remove to get rid of the technocracy. It's almost like this mental inframing that we're stuck within. And to come back to Dave's point he was getting at, specifically with the whole gender issue, is, as far as I see it, this sort of ludicrousy debases these institutions by the day. And for that reason, I see them as a normative good.
Arturo, I believe you're next in line.
Yeah, I think that I don't know what the world without technocracy would look like, except that there'd be more self-management, the downfall of the managerial sciences as they're self-proclaimed. I know Dave finds that a very superficial reading of technocracy. but I must admit I don't understand, and I think I don't agree with the idea that literature in the 1950s or 60s had yet become a technocracy. I think the arts today are definitely technocratic, the way the art world functions, the way the literary world functions, with the MFA programs, which are the therapy laboratory of every expensive Western university. But back then, I mean, maybe T.S. Eliot as a banker was a technocrat, but as a poet, he was definitely not a technocrat. When it comes to what Zizek calls the infinite subjectivity that he sees in the gender ideology, where I am whatever I feel like, I mean, Dave brought up the gender ideology, and I think I agree, and I think this is, but I think this is also, it's a result of our abolition. Our society has abolished psychology, which was, especially those parts of psychology which were too close to the humanities. So, like, a lot of people, they swing and throw mud and, you know, sledgehammers at this Jordan Peterson guy, and they threw the baby out of the bathwater. So they said that, you know, Jordan Peterson, because he's you know, annoying or mediocre or whatever, he and Carl Gustav Jung are a bunch of trash, and they try to undermine Jung. And I think Jung is very important, and you should try to preserve him. And Jung wrote a lot about the sexual persona, wrote a lot about hermaphroditism. He said that some, you know, like, men usually have, in the psychology of romance, the man has an anima, and in the female, the woman has, in the male, animus, and some women have another inner female. So Jung thought a lot about this, but he never denied biological difference. He never, you know, so if we had psychology, then, you know, psychology has been abolished by technocracy, because psychology was too humanistic or too esoteric. It wasn't enough for science. So today's psychology is all based either on neuroscience, or on psychopharmacology, or on CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a way of patching up certain dysfunctions in the person so that they can go back to work, so that they can be reaccommodated in the system. And so we've more or less abolished the humanistic part of psychology, which would have prevented this current confusion of levels, this current crisis, where a person who discovers a new sexual persona, that person will declare himself or herself a new entity, a new everything, and will then deny biological science. I don't know if I'm being clear, but anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are all interesting points. I think the way that we think about these things, about like this like intense way we categorize things, is also kind of playing into this scientistic mindset, sort of in the way we think about these topics. Dave, you had your hand raised.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm very tempted to have another round of that debate on what exactly technocracy is with Arturo, but I will restrain myself. I think I'll just say something about psychology. Yeah, I know what you're talking about there. Absolutely. At the moment, the current, you know, main in the main sense of technocracy, you know, behaviorism is the thing, behavioral economics in particular. But I also think that psychology, you know, traditionally did play a big, you know, for the last 100 years has played a big role in, you know, in general theories of social control. And I think it's still there. I think the way that every middle class educated person nowadays can talk, psychobabble till the cows come home, and is very good at being empathetic and all of that. That's part of technocracy, I think. I really wanted to answer your question, though, Hal, about what a non-technocratic university would look like. So there is a model for that. I mean, there are lots of models for that, including, the kind of models that, people who are involved in decolonial politics are talking about. But yeah, the model that I know, and I'm actually involved in a project at the moment, was the Lucas Plan of the 1970s, which was a group of workers in an arms factory in England who basically developed an alternative plan for their company. And what they did was they put forward 150 ideas of socially useful products, right? So what that showed was that the workers, the people who were, least likely to get into a university, actually had a vast well both of technical knowledge, right? And not only technical knowledge. And that developed later in the 1980s into, in London, we had the GLC, which was the city council, developed these things called technology networks, whereby it put out these technology workshops, working together with universities, but not in the universities, for ordinary people to come forward with their technological ideas and, develop products, based on their own knowledge. So what we're talking about here is basically about the politics of knowledge. The academy is about an elite view of what knowledge is and who possesses it, and we have to break that model. We have to remember that ordinary people in the street have huge wells of knowledge through their personal experience, through their cultural experience, and that actually, as the global techno-based system, which is, as I don't need to tell everybody, is, incredibly created this incredible fragility in the world, is going to break down. We are going to need a lot more of that people's knowledge and community-based knowledge, not just in individual people, but knowledge based in the whole of communities. So yeah, that's my suggestion.
Yeah, no, that reminded me also, I believe in Greece, there's this factory called Diomi or something. I have to look it up. I looked it up right before now. It's called Viomi. It's like a factory that a bunch of Greek workers took over to produce stuff, and it's like a self-managed thing. And you talked a lot about like the way that knowledge, of course, is related to status. And at the time, and you even see this today, I mentioned in my own paper how like the British Prime Minister, other than like Thatcher, which is pretty ironic, has, maybe not, has always been a literary background, their degree. Like it's been, Boris is of course humanities, a whole bunch of these other people have Boris is classics, a whole bunch of these other people have history. And maybe it is this because we did elevate, since then the science has definitely been elevated as even more, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, I doubt that people at today's Cambridge dinner parties for humanities people know any more about the sciences than they did. There maybe is a greater level of awe or penis envy. I always think humanities people are intimidated by the sciences in many ways. OG, you're next.
Muted. I have another 2 hours, Hal. We can sit here longer than 30 minutes.
My goodness, but I don't have another 2 hours.
I know, right? I got to go to work or something. That's crazy. Freaking neoliberalism. That's the problem. You're inframed.
Yeah, I haven't had caffeine yet today. That's
funny. A few things. First off, Michelle Bowman does very good work on commons. He had a great talk with Alexander Barding and Dr. Cadell last on what Mr. King is saying. Zach Stein also does extraordinary work on education. You mentioned Neil Postman. I love that part in Teaching a Subversive Act where he says, we consider consider an educated person who's good at trivia, because you sit in a classroom and the teacher knows they ask a random question. Who can answer it? The smartest person who knows it first. So you come to believe that a smart person is good as trivia. In the medium as the message, he's applying the Marshall McLuhan to education. I love that part. I love Neil Postman that you brought up. And that therefore creates a notion that the smart person is good at trivia, which then, of course, makes you delusion capture, because you're not able to see through the system. You're just participating in the trivia game, and that's a problem. Also, there's a book called Theory of Intellectual Change by Randall Collins. I think that might be helpful as a little map moving forward. Also, the wonderful Justine Brown at her History Channel talks about how when coffee houses were made, they used to be called penny universities. And it's also interesting to think about the Bloomsburg groups, the Scottish Enlightenment, these sort of intellectual things that don't really fit into a university structure, even if these people taught in universities, because there seems to be something different going on. I think when we talk about the university, often we're talking about the system of certification, the system of figuring out where you're located in. It's an entirely another subject, because I really want to get to what Arturo was asking about conspiracies, meaning in art, and so on. But I think what we need to do is break up the college monopoly on credentials, which would require bringing back employment testing from the 70s, which was ruled out by the Supreme Court due to fear of discrimination and racism. But then, of course, you just worry about discrimination and racism at the university. You didn't solve the problem, you just moved it. If universities actually do create value, then let's have some capitalist competition. Then universities will indeed bring forth the best employees, whereas people who say are doing what we're doing on YouTube, doing our own education, will never win to them. And that will prove that the university system is in fact the best. So I think you can introduce a system of competition by getting rid of the monopoly on credentials. I think the monopoly on credentials is systemically the major problem. I also wanted to note that, we were talking about automation and the problems of automation. It would be another subject, but that does indeed overlay with the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, because there's a thoughtlessness. Automation, it's automatic. You don't think about it. Well, the thoughtlessness, which is not the same as stupid. I should have made that distinction. There's thinking, there's smart, stupid, and thoughtless. Thoughtless is something that you don't think about. It's neither stupid nor smart. It's kind of in the background that kind of structures. I call it, to me, it's what organizes your rationality. In my whole epistemology thing is saying the true isn't the rational, whereas, what you believe is true organizes your rationality. If you think it's going to rain today, it's rational to bring an umbrella, right? But then, of course, that means truth comes before rational. So how do you determine your truth? Well, that's an extensive topic. Love to get into you. It can't merely be rational, because then rational is organized by truth. The issue is that the banality of evil operates on the realm of the true, not just the rational. So it organizes rationality in a manner that then it becomes invisible, like the doorknob in Heidegger that you don't notice until it breaks, and then you're a delusion capture, you're inframed, you don't even know what's going on. You're trapped in that internally consistent system, which is what a conspiracy is. And to Arturo's point, the reason people fall into conspiracies, a few reasons. One, there's such thing as true conspiracies. You can't tell just because it's a conspiracy that it's false. There are lots of true conspiracies. There's also false conspiracies. How do you know which is which? Oh, you have to investigate it. Oh, crap. Because once you start investigating it, it starts filtering your experience in such a way, like a Thomas Pynchon novel, The Crying Lot of 49, to where then it becomes self-justifying, and I call it the pitch and risk. You can also get into the Japanese Seiichi Kon novels, like Perfect Blue, or all those great classics that also talk about this structure of capture as you go in. But the issue is, it could be true. You can't know if it's true unless you go into it. Just because something's an ideology doesn't mean it's false, right? There's such thing as true ideology. I don't actually like when people make a distinction between, say, like truth and ideology, because we're all in ideology, and that's a Zizekian point. And I think when you do that, you just other, then what ends up happening is ideology is what other people have, you don't. So it just feeds tribalism in the same way that people tend to go, I just read books while you interpret them. Interpretation is what other people do. We just read, right? So I think it's important to emphasize that we're always already in an internally consistent system. And then I had, Arturo, I would also say I had a wonderful conversation with a very good friend of mine, Mr. Lorenzo, on what we call Pandora's rationality, the topic of conspiracies. It's very elaborate. It gets into meaning, it gets into the structure of epistemology, it gets into essential incompleteness of epistemology itself. I would turn you to that discussion. We tried to do a document, and I hope that would fill in some of the gaps here. And the last thing I'll say is I want to speak on what Arturo is saying is the emphasis on mystery. I do think there is something to be said about art today not having what I like to call ontological stakes. When you go back to, say, a Tolstoy, a Dostoevsky, a Hart Crane, a Wallace Stevens, and so on, there's like an ontological stake that is at play. Something vertical, if we want to use Kierkegaardian language. Where art today tends to be very horizontal. It tends to be about relationships. It tends to be about love. It tends to be identity, which tends to be, it kind of seems deep, but it's actually more horizontal because it's about how you relate to other people. And likewise, politics in general, you were talking about the general gender and different things. That's all kind of the politics of recognition, how we should be recognized in our relation. And if what we identify ourselves should be what other people are forced to identify us with, what's the correct ethics of that? But that's quite different from, say, a vertical politics where you ask questions of what is the good? What is, say, the human? That kind of reminds me of After Virtue with McAllister, where he talks about we're no longer able to have, say, moral conversations anymore because we don't even agree on shared paradigms and frameworks and axioms by which a discussion would be possible. So you have a movement generally, if I use this Kierkegaardian language, from the vertical to the horizontal, and that is reflected in your politics, that is reflected in your arts, that is reflected in your general thinking. But of course, the thing is, if you're just horizontal, you never have any experiences of the vertical to know you're even missing out on a vertical per se. So it becomes a kind of, it's a self, it justifies itself. And the thing I was going to say, I think basically the way to escape that internally consistent system of ideology is indeed things like mystery and beauty and art. And I'll reference Flannery O'Connor because you brought him up in your paper. You know, she has that idea, I think it's the Catholic in the South or something, where she talks about mystery. And a mystery is not something you don't know. It's something that, as you know, you find out there's more to know, and that transforms who you are and what you're capable of as you approach it. It's kind of it's like a pulling you forth. And that's what he's kind of talking about with the church fathers. You can get a Master Eckhart, obviously, Aquinas, et cetera, where mystery is something that pulls you and changes you as it goes. Now, what's so funny in all of her stories, in this, to bring it together, you know, all of her stories, whether it be the lame shall enter first, I'll reference Greenleaf, they end with the grotesque, right? Everyone talks about the grotesque. The key is the reason, like in Greenleaf, and here's the spoiler alert to 1950s literature that everyone should read. I feel like you can get out of the spoiler alert on that one because it's, you know, it's classic literature. Anyway, in Greenleaf, there's this woman who's very, dare I say, self-conceited, egotist, because she's very sure of herself and what she's doing, kind of a control freak. The only thing that kind of breaks her through, Flannery O'Connor describes a bull piercing through her as the action of grace, helping her wake up. And all throughout her stories, like her novels called like The Violent Will Bear Fruit, there's this kind of breaking through that has to occur because we become so locked in our internal consistent system, our idea of how the world works, that God's grace, because he's a Christian, operates by like a kind of violence. It's not like grace in Flannery O'Connor is not like a hug or love or different things. For her, she says, no. When you get so lost in sin, love actually just gets incorporated into the problem because it doesn't wake you up. It has to be a bull that's kind of piercing you through. And she describes the bull in Greenleaf as the horn kind of hugging her as it's pulling through. And that's what wakes you up. And really what's quite interesting is, for me, it would seem as if the choice for the transformation that we're all pointing to that seems to need to occur to escape delusion, capture, and so on and so forth, seems to be that it either has to be a bull that pierces us through and forces us to wake up, like a collapse of the system, people will talk about, accelerationism, or, and this is where my hope lies, on a orientation to a mystery that engagement in the arts can calibrate and condition one toward, that pulls them toward the vertical without desperation and violence. It seems to be a choice between the aesthetic orientation or some sort of collapse of the system. Those seems to be, it's one of those two things that gets you from the horizontal to the vertical. Thus, you know, the truism, the rational, and the work we do leads to the fate of beauty and really calibrating on what we call conditionalism and mystery and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much, all of you, for saying, yeah, no, I do really wish this could go on for a while. And definitely in the chat, people talked all about like, oh, maybe we should do another conference on Verla. I'd be really interested in any sort of future conference. Of course, I have to read a lot more of the materials. I don't really know much about him. I believe he's written stuff on Speed. That's all I believe. That's him. But yeah, no, it was wonderful to hear all of your discussions about this sort of thing. It's funny, you don't know what to expect coming in, but you can get a lot out of it. It appears that a lot of us here are frustrated as much with the way we're thinking about things and the institutions in which we're thinking about things than this kind of maybe more simplistic dichotomy between the scientific and the literary realm of thinking. But yeah, no, I also would say that for me that I really appreciate how this has gone, and thank you all very much.